Today we take up Spock's first command in the Galileo 7.
Compliance, the final frontier. Tom Fox is the voyager of trekking through compliance. His mission? To explore the original series and seek out and share what it can teach you about compliance. Here's your host, Tom Fox.
Episode 16, the Galileo 7, Start 8, 2821.5. As the Enterprise is on its way to New Paris on Marcus 3, it encounters a strange natural phenomenon. Commissioner Ferris wants Kirk to hurry on to New Paris, but Kirk is under orders to study all quasars and quasar-like phenomena, and so stops the Enterprise in order to do so. Kirk launches the shuttlecraft Galileo with Spock, Scotty, Boma, Latimer, Gaetano, and Yeoman Mears aboard. The 24-foot shuttlecraft is pulled off course into the Murasaki 312 electromagnetical storm and crash lands on Tarsus 2. It and its crew are in one piece, but the shuttlecraft is gravely damaged. As Spock puts it, "Picturesque descriptions will not mend broken circuits, Mr. Scott. I believe you have your work cut out for you." Tarsus 2 seems safe at first with an oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere, so Spock sends Latimer and Gaetano outside to scout the area. Meanwhile, Commissioner Ferris continues pressuring Kirk to leave the shuttle behind in order to get the needed medicine to the plague victims on New Paris, but Kirk continues the search until the last possible moment. In an act of desperation, Kirk sends out the shuttlecraft Columbus to search Tarsus 2. On Tarsus 2, Spock gets his first taste of command, much to the resentment of his crew. Spock sums up his views on command by stating, "I neither enjoy the idea of command, nor am I frightened by it. It simply exists." Scott determines that much of the fuel has been lost and that the shuttlecraft's weight must be reduced by 500 pounds if it is to achieve escape velocity. While scouting the area, Latimer and Gaetano enter a thick mist. They then hear a croaking noise and are shortly thereafter attacked by the planet's 10 to 12-foot ape-like inhabitants. Latimer is killed by a spear whose tip resembles a Folsom point, but Spock's archaeological knowledge just makes his crew even more resentful. Boma insists on a funeral for Latimer, but Spock remains inside the craft with Scott trying to fix it. Unfortunately, they lose the remaining fuel when a line breaks. The crew wants to attack the apes, but Spock does not wish to because it would unnecessarily take life. So he instructs them to fire on them to frighten them but not kill them. Spock orders Boma to help with the repairs, and Gaetano is left behind. Alone and terrified, his phaser is knocked away, and then he is mauled to death. Scotty proposes powering the shuttlecraft by draining energy from the phasers, which is all well and good, except that it is the crew's only remaining defense against the planet's inhabitants. Spock goes to investigate what became of Gaetano and carries his body back despite a rain of spears from the ape-like inhabitants. Arriving back safely, Spock is surprised that his logical decisions have resulted in 2 deaths and the antagonism of his crew. The crew retreats to the craft, which is then set upon by one of the inhabitants with a large rock. Spock comes up with the idea of draining the batteries to electrify the exterior of the ship, which grants them a temporary reprieve. Unbeknownst to the crew of the Galileo, Kirk beams down landing parties, but they are unable to discover anything. Lieutenant Kelowitz from Landing Party 2 reports 1 dead, 2 injured by the anthropod creatures, whose databases classify them as resembling creatures from Hansen's planet. Scotty manages to get the shuttlecraft off the ground after tarrying shortly to give Spock time to get on board after he is slightly injured. The Galileo's crew is saved when Spock jettisons and ignites the fuel to serve as a flare for the Enterprise. This gives them only a few minutes before re-entering the planet's atmosphere, but allows them to be seen and transported safely back to the Enterprise. Kirk needles Spock about his act of desperation, and Spock defends his action as logical considering all other alternatives have been exhausted. Fun fact, Leonard Nimoy struggled with his role of Spock in this episode in many of his scenes because he had to account for the absence of William Shatner, who, of course, was Captain Kirk. Really, this episode speaks to me today, this year, 2022, about training for emergencies. And I can think of no greater emergency than befell the city of Uvalde, Texas, a couple of weeks ago when a shooter went into an elementary school. The police department had been trained on strategy and tactics as dictated by the state of Texas in response to an active shooter at an elementary school. And unfortunately, it looks like everyone did everything they were supposed to except the police department. And within the police department, I would say many of the policemen did what they were supposed to do, and the fault lies with the commander on site. The commander on site was the chief of police of the Uvalde Independent School District, and he had the smallest, least experienced force on site, yet he was the commander due to the eccentricity of the way jurisdictional disputes over handling those types of situations are handled in the state of Texas. You have to practice. And I think what this means for a compliance officer is you have to mentor your compliance staff so that if they do have to step up in a leadership role, whether it's in the crisis of Uvalde or in the crisis that Spock faced with the crash of the Galileo 7, that he understands what's required of him of leadership. And sometimes you have to let your crewmen bury their dead crewmen as a sign of a respect going forward. Next up, compliance takeaway. So what are some of the compliance takeaways from this episode? Well, a very important scene in this was around the burial of Latimer. And Spock does not want to risk burying Latimer. He doesn't want to risk any more of the crewmen. But Boma insists that Spock allow him to bury Latimer. And this becomes a real point of contention. So I think for the compliance officer, you need to respect the local cultures and, more importantly, local traditions. So sometimes you're going to have to simply do that. Next up is a issue that we have talked about multiple times already in this podcast series, which is what is risk? What did not appear to be a risky endeavor. There were no reported life forms on the planet when they landed, and when the creatures, after having been shown the superior firepower of the Galileo 7, they still attacked, and this really flummoxed Spock. His risk management strategy was based upon a logical response, and as we know from behavioral economics, people don't always behave logically. And indeed, even with financial incentives, people will still not only walk up to the line, but they'll cross that line. So what is risk? How does risk change? What does risk mean? And more importantly, how does your risk management strategy morph to meet the ever-changing business risks of your organization? So are you going into a new country? Do you have a new product? Are you going to a new geographic area? Do you have a new customer base? Is it your first time in a big tender? All of these potentially could be risks, factors that you might need to monitor a little more carefully. And finally, as a CCO, and once again, you have to adjust to the facts on the ground as you know them, and more importantly, as they present themselves to you. I hope you'll join us tomorrow for our next episode, which will be episode 17 in our 79-episode exploration of Star Trek, the original series, where we take up the ever-popular Squire of Gothos.
If you enjoyed this episode of Trekking Through Compliance, you can help it grow by sharing it with the biggest Trek fan you know.
This podcast is a part of the C-Suite Radio Network. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.